Alrighty, well, we're just waiting for people to enter. Just to let you know, we will be recording today's session and we'll be sending you out a copy in an email after today's session as well. So if you miss anything, you can revisit it at any time. And if you've got any questions for our panelists, just pop them in the Q&A function down the bottom of your screen.
Good afternoon, everybody. Thanks for joining us all today at BlueRock's webinar on the Export Market Development Grant. It's a very exciting topic. Firstly, for those of us who are new or don't know too much about BlueRock, BlueRock is a multifaceted professional services firm, and we work with business owners and entrepreneurs to help grow their businesses. At the moment, the firm's got 14 separate divisions, including accounting, law, tax, super, and many others. So we're looking forward to today's webinar. As we mentioned, today's webinar, there'll be an opportunity to answer questions. So if you've got any questions as they come up, please pop them into the question and answer in the ribbon in the Zoom below. We'll try to answer those live as we go through the session, but if not, we've got a section towards the back for question and answers where we'll be able to hopefully answer those questions for you. And then, of course, if you've got any follow-up questions following, please feel free to reach out and email us because you'll be getting a follow-up email with a recording of today's session. So looking forward to that. So with that said, I'd like to introduce Tom and Millie from BlueRock's Grants and Incentives team. It's great to have you both along today.
Thanks, Aaron.
Thanks, Aaron.
And so, Tom, just before we launch into it, can you just give us a quick roundup of how does your team help business owners and entrepreneurs?
Yeah, so we, in a nutshell, we help businesses get funding from mainly government grants and incentives. Well, grants we tend to mean, when we say grants, we mean sort of competitive programs where you might be, there might be a sort of a pool of money and you make an application, etc. Incentives is more like entitlements, which is if you do A, you are entitled to B.
Fantastic. And I guess today's topic is all about the Export Market Development Grant. Millie, how long has this program been running for?
Oh, a very long time, about half a century. It started in 1974, and since then about $6 billion worth of grant funding has been paid out to about 50,000 different Australian businesses. So yeah, the government is definitely wanting to get behind our Aussie businesses and help them export and promote their products overseas, and have been doing so for quite a while now.
Wow, I had no idea it had been around for that long. It's very exciting. And I think recently the programs, they've announced a few changes. How's that playing out?
Yeah, exactly. They have. And that is essentially why we're on this call today, to run through what those changes are. But so the reasons behind why those changes have come to be is because over the last 50 years, the legislation has grown to about 200 pages in length. And it is quite an arduous and detailed experience to apply for the grant. So essentially, Austrade wants to do its best to help out Aussie businesses. So they've simplified the guidelines. They're making the application process a lot more streamlined. And as you will all soon learn, it is becoming a forward-looking grant, so that it means that you know how much of grant money you're entitled to up front, rather than waiting to apply for and find out how much you're going to get post the financial year once the money's already been spent.
Yeah, perfect. I guess the big thing with government grants and these incentives, before you want to know, is that often there can be a lot of work involved in applying for them, and sometimes you're successful, sometimes you're not. So I guess, Tom, the big question that we want to answer is, how hard is this to get?
Yeah, I agree with that. You know, sometimes it's a painful process and it can be really disappointing at the end. The good thing about the export grant is it works like an entitlement. So there's a legislation that says you have to get, if you're eligible, you will get at least some of the grant. It's really widely available. It's relatively easy to apply for. But that said, you know, sometimes the application process can be quite, detailed. And that's sort of where we come in, and we help businesses make that as easy as possible and get the most out of the program.
Yeah, fantastic. I've got a few clients or a number of clients who qualify for this grant. and it is a really good one. And generally, it's probably at the easier end of the scale in terms of workload and process.
Yeah.
And then I guess, what's it like working with Austrade?
It 9.5 times out of 10, it's really good. So Austrade's job and their mandate is to help Australian businesses to export. So they're very pro-business. They are here to help, but they're also the gatekeeper of the program. And where there's government incentives, you'll find that there can be, fraud and dishonesty. So they're quite meticulous in the way they administer the program, and that is to safeguard it, I guess, and make sure that it continues for a long time as it has. Yeah.
Perfect. Well, very exciting. So with all of that said, I think let's jump into the details. Millie, can you just how does it all work?
Yeah, for sure. We'll just bring our slides up for everyone so that they can follow along as we're running through all the details here. Here's our very nice introductory slide, the Export Market Development Grant, as you might hear us referring to as the EMDG, but it's the Export Market Development Grant that we're referring to here. So basically, as alluded to earlier, the Export Market Development Grant started a long time ago, and it was brought about to help Aussie businesses grow their businesses through their export promotion activities. The way that the program is moving forward is that the grant will be agreed upfront, but paid out in arrears. But the reason that this has changed is so that at least you know how much money is going to be coming in once you meet your milestone acquittal timeline, which we'll get into as we go through the slides. Okay, so talking about we're not going to focus so much on the old program, but for anyone who is on the call today who may be familiar with the old program, I guess the main things we wanted to point out are the biggest changes. I mean, the application process has completely changed, but otherwise in terms of the eligibility criteria and how much you can access, we'll just quickly high level run through those. So basically, instead of applying at the end of the year or after the financial year, we're now applying at the start of the financial year based on your forecasted spend. Eligible entities, some people may now be kicked out of the program because your turnover now needs to be less than 20 million. And you are still entitled up to 50% back on your marketing expenses, except that now you will be streamlined into 3 different tiers, which rather than being a flat 150% maximum grant that it used to be, you'll fit into 3 different categories that I will shortly go into more detail, but your maximum cap might be 40, 80, or 150. There is no longer a minimum expense that you need to meet before you can access the program. And also, if you are part of a wider group of entities with a number of different entities applying, who are the principal exporters of those various services or goods, you won't be capped as a group. Each entity applies in their own right and can access the maximum grant they're entitled to based on their tier. So they're the main changes that those of you who know the old program might be interested in. So how much do we get through the program? So basically, it is an entitlement. It's a year-on-year entitlement, but you do cap out at certain points. So the program will either allow you to claim the EMDG funding for 8 years unless you hit the $770,000 cap first. In saying that, so you can access it for the 8 years unless you reach 770, but just remembering that every year that you apply, there will be certain caps placed on the amount of funding that you get. So the terminology we use is up to 50%, because basically because it is coming from a fixed pool of funding, and it is an entitlement. So basically everyone who applies is entitled to some grant money. However, if there are more applicants who are asking for more money than what fits within the pool, they will have to prorata the amounts across all the applicants. So that 50% might drop to 47% or 42% year on year. That will change depending on the number of applicants that have applied. And again, that 50% is also capped at the relevant tiers that you will be in, which I think is coming up in the next slide or two. So keeping all that in mind, 8 years, 770, up to 50% because of the fixed pool of funding. And then we also need to consider your cap relevant to each year that you apply. So next slide. Thank you, Tom. So here we go. Finally, getting on to the tiers that I feel like I've been going on about. So basically the way the program now works, and Austrade has looked into what part of the export journey applicants have been on previously. So although they're now sort of capping you based on where you are at in your export journey, they have relied on the history of applicants before to come up with these caps that should be reasonable based on where you are at in your journey. So starting at the bottom, we're at tier 1. So basically you haven't exported before, but you have your product that you are ready to commercialize, ready to start marketing and ready to sell in countries outside of Australia and New Zealand. So new to export, you're tier 1, you haven't made a sale yet, but you're ready to go. Your maximum grant amount is $40,000. So just remembering that this is a 50% match funding program. So to access that $40,000, you're looking at least spending $80,000 in your marketing and promotional activities to access that upper limit for tier 1. Next stage, you're already sitting comfortable, you've exported before, you're making some good sales in the countries or country that you're currently exporting to. However, you want to start to push that a bit more. So you're expanding you're expanding your marketing activities in an existing market. So you're already in the US, you're going to continue to push your services and products to the US, then you'll fit into tier 2, which brings your cap up to $80,000. So spend 160, you'll get 80. Spend any more than 160, you're still capped at that $80,000 maximum grant amount. However, if you're then looking to do a strategic shift, is the wording used by Austrade, where you're either looking to expand into a new market, maybe target a different demographic, bring a new product to market, then we can argue a strategic shift, which then brings you back up to that maximum grant amount that it has historically been, which gives you access to up to $150,000. So spend $300,000 and you'll get the maximum grant amount through the program as a tier 3 applicant of $150,000.
Awesome. Hey, Millie, couple of questions.
Yep.
First, do I have to spend the whole do I have to claim the whole $40,000, for example?
Oh, no. No, so sorry, I could have been more clear about that. So to access the $40,000, you need to at least spend 80 to get that 40. However, if you end up only spending 60 or even $20,000 because you're new, you just want to dip a toe in the water and see how you go, well, then your grant amount will just be adjusted. So if you're spending 60, your grant will be up to 30. If you're spending 20, it will be up to 10. Okay.
And the next question, do I have to move through the tiers in order, sort of two tiers year 1, 3 tiers year, other way around? You know what I mean?
Yeah, I know what you mean. So no, so you don't have to, you're not basically cut out of the program because you might already be exporting or you're already looking at a strategic shift. Oh dear, you've missed your opportunity at tier 1. That doesn't matter. You can enter the program at any point, and you can also shift between, obviously tier 1, that's quite a specific situation if you've not exported before, but basically you can shift between tier 2 and 3, and you can also enter at any point. So you might jump into the program and be like, hey, we're already exporting in the US, but we're now targeting the UK. You come in at tier 3, you might then drop back into tier 2, and then actually we're now going to focus on selling to Singapore. So then you might jump up to tier 3 again after a number of years. I'm just going to preempt another comment that might come through. You don't actually need to apply 8 years in succession. You might apply for tier 3, do your 3-year grant agreement under tier 3, drop out of the program for a number of years while you sit back, relax, see how it all goes, and then you might want to jump in again in 3 to 5 years time. So you don't need to apply year on year. You can pick and choose when you come in and come out. You just can't exceed that 8-year limit.
Great. And there's one more question. It's a nice, easy one. You mentioned spend outside of Australia and New Zealand. Is New Zealand an eligible market? I mean, obviously it's an export market.
Yeah, so I guess because New Zealand, as Tom is on the call today, one of our friendly guys from across the pond, or whatever the saying is, but they're a little too close to home. They're probably a little too easy. There's a lot of relationships there. So Austrade is wanting to focus on those bigger markets that are a bit further away and maybe harder for little Aussie companies to access. So unfortunately, New Zealand falls outside of the scope of an eligible country for this program.
Yeah, it is a strange one, and it seemed, I found out recently, it's actually because of the wording of our free trade agreement between the two countries that we can't, the Australian government can't help Australian businesses go to New Zealand. So that's an
there you
interesting
go.
one.
Yeah.
Thanks for that, Millie.
No worries.
So how can you be eligible for the grant? So you must be an Australian entity with an ABN. You don't have to be a company. So some other grants require you to be a company. That's not the case here. For example, you can be an individual or trading out of a trust structure. You'll still be eligible. You must be ready to export or be exporting. So and that you would have some evidence to that effect. So for example, if I formed a company here today and applied for the grant tomorrow without a business plan or anything to that effect, I probably would not be eligible. But otherwise, if you're in business with some intention to export or have been exporting, you'll be fine on that criteria. You must have products, and I'll touch on what products are in a second, that are of a substantially Australian origin. So often, you know, in the modern world, there are global touch points for products. It really is on balance, you know, whether that product has a substantial Australian origin. And there's some categories and information to that effect. And I won't go into the weeds on it now, because there is a lot of gray area, let's say. But if you have a product, for example, where part of the manufacturing process is overseas and part is in Australia, that overseas part doesn't disqualify you from claiming this grant. So it doesn't have to be straight out of Australia, but it is important that it has Australian touch point, which I'm guessing if you're on the call, your product probably will.
Hey, Tom, just a quick one. What's an example of a product that absolutely wouldn't qualify?
So one of the things we've seen that absolutely does not qualify is drop shipping. So for example, where you sell something overseas and it's manufactured overseas, doesn't ever come to Australia, and there's no value added by any Australian action, that would not be eligible. So
An interesting question has come through talking about, what about a service provider or digital solutions?
Yes, I will touch on services in a moment. But in effect, the service must be delivered from Australia or be adding value have value added in Australia. So for example, the assets in Australia, behind the assets behind the business are in Australia. Services is a funny one because, you know, for example, if you're you're a presenter, you're a speaker, and you go and present at conferences and you want to sell your services, you obviously have to travel to deliver your service. So that there are caveats in place where you can still claim the EMDG for promoting that service, even though it's not delivered from Australia, as in your boots on the ground aren't in Australia. And also you've got to have a turnover of less than $20 million in the financial year before you claim. So that's a big change, because as Millie said, it used to be 50 million. So there is a lot of those medium to large size businesses that are going to miss out under the new program. And just a couple of reasons you might be disqualified. Disqualifying convictions, I won't talk too much about what they are, but they're, you know, a list of things that I guess behaviors or black marks against your business, you as a director or your business, that might disqualify you, or if you're trading while insolvent. And that's measured in real time. So even if you have a grant agreement and you become insolvent, that can disqualify you from receiving the grant in the future. So eligible products. So there are 6 categories there as to what makes an eligible product. Goods. So goods would be something manufactured in Australia or at least have significant value added in Australia. Services. The example I've got there's an architecture studio. You might have a digital design studio, for example, or you might be a marketing agency. So again, those services must, on balance, be delivered from Australia or have their value derived from Australian activities. One that surprises some people is inbound tourism. So if you're delivering a tourism service here in Australia, that's classed as an export. It's when it's delivered to foreign buyers. So I guess it's that old definition of exports being the foreign currency coming into Australia. IP and know-how. So if you are selling, licensing your IP and you promote that overseas, you can be eligible for this grant. We've got events. Now the events are for people to buy or for you to promote Australian products. So an example would be, the example I've got there would be a boat show, for example. If you run a boat show in Australia and you market to foreign people to come to Australia to go to your show, that would be eligible. And software is its own category. So the marketing of the software, and again, it would need to be substantially or wholly developed in Australia. Any questions or comments on that one? Because I guess that's quite a crucial slide, is do you have an eligible product? Pop them in the chat and we'll see if we can answer them.
It'd be interesting, Tom, the software one, that can be quite complex because, is it based on where the development happens, or is it where the people who have created the concept of the product are instructing the developers? That's an example. Somebody in Australia instructing offshore developers how to make it. I guess we might be potentially living in Australia or potentially being created offshore.
Yeah, so there's exactly what will, if there's any software developers on the call, what you quite often find is part of the teams overseas for various reasons. And Austrade, again, it's one of those ones where they're not going to disqualify you for that, but there's a case to make, and there's actually a document that you end up producing as to why the benefit of you exporting comes to Australia. I'll touch on that a little bit now in the next 2 slides, but as I said, it is a complex issue. So if we don't wholly answer your question, do get in touch and we can go into the specific issue. So as I've said, it doesn't have to be wholly Australian made. Goods, running through those products in order, goods need to be made or assembled in Australia. And there are some exceptions for goods made overseas where Australia gets a really clear, strong benefit from the sale. Things like jobs in Australia, IP held in Australia, etc. Services, so regardless of where the service is delivered, the value must be added in Australia and generate employment in Australia. Tourism, as you would expect, requires foreign buyers coming in. So domestic advertising to domestic tourism isn't going to qualify. Events I've touched on. IP and know-how, it's different depending on whether you're trying to license the use of a trademark or any other IP, so a patent, for example. Or even if it's not protected, just your process. You might be selling your manufacturing process, for example, to a foreign buyer. So that for a trademark, it has to have been used in Australia first, or you need to prove that it increased in value because of Australian activities. And for everything else, it must be a result of work done in Australia. So for example, research and development in Australia, design in Australia, these would be things that would help us get that across the line. And software must be wholly or substantially developed in Australia and be the result of software R&D in Australia. There are some specific exclusions. I won't go over them today, but be aware that not every single product is eligible. And what can you claim? So what can you put in your 40 grand, 80 grand, whatever it might be that you're trying to get the grant for? There are, what have we got now? 9 categories. Overseas representatives. So these are people that you place on the ground overseas. We can claim their salary or their contractor's fee. And we can only claim the retainer portion. So something that has caught people out in the past is where they place salespeople on commissions. Austrade doesn't allow that. I've never found out why, but mate, if you do have someone currently on a commission structure and you're looking at getting the grant, what we have done in the past is work with businesses to just renegotiate with their salespeople to have a retainer portion so that we've got something that can be claimed in the grant and a commission portion. And we can help with that and get the wording right in that contract so that Austrade will accept it.
Because that's obviously quite a big chunky expense that will be eligible. Is there any other requirements around that? So it's got placed for 6 months plus. So is that the duration of the contract or? Yeah.
So it does need to be a long-term placement. Those who have claimed the grant before might remember it used to be 12 months. It's 6 months now. So if you are, for example, sending over your Australian business development person, you would need to be sending them for 6 months or more for that to be eligible. Now, if something goes wrong and they have to come home, you're not going to be disqualified. It's more about your intention to send them overseas for a long time. There's also a cap on that category. So you can't, if you're on the $150,000 grant, that will come into play, and you can't claim all of the cost on your overseas reps. But yeah, as you say, if you're claiming the $40,000 grant and you're paying an overseas salesperson, probably going to have a salary of towards $80,000 at the least, and that can be a whole grant right there.
Yeah.
Short trips. So this is you can travel overseas. If you remember back in the day, we used to be able to do that, and we went. Business people went overseas. The costs of that trip are eligible. And also, this is a new one, short trips within Australia are eligible if you're looking to solicit business from foreign buyers. So if the trade show is in Australia that you want to attend and there's evidence that it has an international audience, you can still claim for that. Question from Wendy, I'll try and answer live. Here we go. The question is, do sales activities overseas include participation in sponsorship of virtual conferences? There has been some notes about that. Millie, do you remember? I can't remember off the top of my head what it might be one we have to come back to.
Yeah, well, I think basically, if you've got an overseas audience and that's the reason for attending the online conference, then there would be an argument that whatever payment you needed to make, or wherever you needed to go to jump online to attend that conference, as long as you can argue there was this international audience that was listening in, and that's how I was going to hopefully develop networks, solicit business, yada, yada, then we can look to bring that cost in. But essentially, yeah, hopefully that answers your question, Wendy.
Good. Millie, just to put a bit more around this one, I'm familiar with this topic. This is an actual international event that previously ran, say, in New York, and has ran there for the last 15 years. And because of coronavirus, they've popped it online. Does that add a bit more background?
Yeah. Look, I believe because there's no trip, you're not claiming it under that category, but you can claim it under other categories anyway. So the sponsorship, for example, might be advertising, and we can put it in there. The cost of attendance at the conference might be claimed as sort of action taken to solicit business overseas. So it's certainly claimable. It's just not clear to me right now which category it's claimable under, but I'll come back to you on that one, Wendy.
Yeah, I think it's the soliciting business. So we haven't, soliciting business is a little, sounds strange. So we haven't particularly used that terminology on the slides here, but soliciting business is attending trade shows, conferences, yada, yada, where you do have that international exposure. I think it would come under that. But yeah, obviously, if you're not actually flying to New York, those expenses won't be as big as they used to be, but you can certainly, whatever it costs you to get in front of that audience can come into the claim.
Yeah. I'm just conscious of time, so I'm going to go through these next ones very quickly. If you have any questions, do just pop them in the chat and we'll try and get those answered before the end of the call. So bringing foreign buyers to Australia, that's people you bring in to, for example, view your product or to have meetings or to wine and dine them to generate sales. Export consultants, so those are people, groups, whether they're in Australia or overseas, that might help you with strategy to enter foreign markets. They might help you with some of these sort of, if it's a completely unfamiliar market, you might find that there are experts in going into that market, and the fee for those consultants is claimable. Sales events overseas, which is sort of tied into the short trips, but the cost of going to the events, going to the conferences, but also of things like having a pop-up shop. We've had claimants who've organised events overseas and claim the cost of organising that event and bringing some customers into that event that they themselves set up. Free samples, just the catch there is at cost, so at cost of goods sold. Advertising, standard advertising, search, pay-per-click, etc. IP protection, so not just the cost of the trademark or the patent or whatever it might be to register the IP, but also the legal fees. So anyone on the call who's tried to register a patent or a trademark will probably know that you're quite quickly in the sort of middle 5 figures to get that done. And the good news is that the cost of that is claimable for this grant. And the last one here is a new one, training. So if you're in that tier 1 category and you feel like you or your staff need some training for the export market and you find a good course that you'd like to put them through, we can claim that cost. And we've got another question here that I can answer. So the question is, are fees around the legalities of operating in an overseas market eligible? Now the answer to that is no. So that's one where we have put it in front of Austrade before and had them say quite clearly that it was a no. So anything like tax advice, legal advice around your ability to operate in that environment, legal advice for employing people overseas, so employment contract advice, for example, that isn't eligible. So just be aware of that when applying for your grant. Thanks, Joe, for that question. All right, Millie, I'll throw it back to you.
Sure thing.
To talk about the transition briefly, because I'm sure we have people on the call who
may have questions.
Have applied for the grant previously, and now it's the new grant. Are they eligible for both, etc.?
Yep, sure thing. So basically the transitional arrangements will come into play moving from the old scheme to the new scheme, because the 8-year cap is similar to both. So you don't reset because we're moving to the new forward funding program. Your history still applies. So basically, I think it stretches back to about 1990 where the 8-year cap came in, and that still applies. So if you have previously claimed EMDG, you need to consider how much grant funding you've received in the past, how many years have you claimed? Because if we remember back to what I spoke about towards the beginning, you're only eligible for either, whatever you reach first, 8 years or $770,000. So before applying, if you are aware that in the history, there might have been a changeover in directorship. However, the business still does follow, the history follows the business, sorry. So just make sure that you're looking in, are aware of how much you've received in the past and how many applications you have made, so that you don't spend your time potentially putting in an application which you're not going to get awarded because you've maxed out the cap there.
Thank you. All right.
No worries. So I guess we can just bring it home relatively quickly over the next few slides. So we've definitely delved into all the eligibility criteria, who you need to be, what you need to be selling, what can you spend your money on, what those activities are, and how much you can expect to receive back. The process of applying, I'll just run through this relatively quickly. Basically, there's an Austrade online portal that you populate your application form through. There are also some requirements that Tom has touched on earlier, attachments that need to be lodged with your application form, and they include the goods or services substantially originating from Australia. That documentation needs to be uploaded, as well as your plan to market, which is basically, I'll go into more detail on that shortly, but essentially your grant milestone agreement will be based on what goes into your plan to market. What goes into that, I'll touch on shortly. And then obviously, because we need to make sure that the company isn't undergoing liquidation, and to make sure that you've got the funds to fund your portion of the grant agreement, and that you are fall under that $20 million turnover category, you also need to upload your prior year's profit and loss statements. So they're basically the three main attachments, as well as filling in the application within the online portal. Something that we do need to bang on about, particularly today, we've got it highlighted there, is that the deadline is the 30th of November this year. So we have just over a month to get these in, and remembering that it's an important one because we're looking at not only FY22, but you can apply for FY23 and FY24 and get some assurity as to how much you can expect to receive back from Austrade based on your forecasted marketing expenses early next year. I think I've got the dates in another slide, but February we can expect to receive those milestone grant agreements coming out. Oh, there we go. Yep. Successful applicants will be offered their grant agreement, and then you'll know exactly what your milestone payment requirements are that will be built based on your plan to market. So Tom, if you want to jump to the next slide.
Yeah, sure. I'll just add, in case there are people who are brand new to the grant on the call, it is an annual grant. So when we say the deadline is this year, it does come out again next year, and it will come out from July next year. But next year, the deadline will be much sooner. So don't fall into the trap of thinking it's November every year. It's likely to be August next year.
And Tom, just to clarify on that, we're looking at it's about a month away. How long is it going to take us to put the grants together? So, you know, if somebody on the call saying, you know, this is us, I think we're going to qualify, it feels like you've got to make a decision fairly sort of quickly on this one.
Yeah, I would allow yourself an absolute minimum of 2 weeks. It can be done quicker, but it might be a few late nights to get everything together and get an application in. So I would say ASAP would be when you want to be getting that done.
Yep.
Thanks,
Sooner rather than later.
Yeah.
So sort of moving on from, or on the same vein as what Tom was just mentioning. So we've got a little table here that sort of shows that for the current year, if you do want to pick up your FY22 expenditure, what you have spent the last almost 6 months and what you plan to forecast over the next 6 months, you will need to apply by November, the end of November this year. And as I alluded to earlier, you should receive your grant agreements. Austrade is saying at the moment that they anticipate to get those out by February. Again, they need to wait till all applications are in because of that fixed pool of funding. See all the applicants, how much are they asking for before they can then divvy out the money appropriately. So therefore, because this year is quite a late one, because of this transitional year where also we're still open for FY21 applicants based on what you have historically spent in the last 12 months, we're anticipating that FY22 first payments won't be until the end of the FY22 financial year. However, going forward, if you're not quite there yet, you're not ready to apply, however, you might be ready for FY23, the grant portal will open much earlier than this year. I think it's open for about 6 weeks, opening late June. Should they need to be in, at the moment, it's anticipated by the end of July. Get your grant agreement within 8 to 10 weeks, and then your payout dates and what those milestone requirements are will determine when you get paid out. So it might be 12 monthly, but it could be 6 monthly. We just need to see what Austrade puts into each individual applicant's milestone, or I shouldn't say milestone, but grant agreements essentially.
Yeah. So that I guess has been a frustrating teething problem for the new grant for us and for our client base. Originally promised as an upfront grant, or an upfront grant agreement at least. It's now unlikely that you'll find out until February. That said, going forward in future years, it's likely to be much sooner. So, and we've got a really good question here. The question is, so from the 30th November deadline, is that for eligible spend incurred between 1 July 2021 and 30 June 2022, or spend 1st July 2022 to 30 June 2023?
Yeah, so yep, I'll answer that one, Tom. So if you want to pick up FY22 expenditure, so from 1 July 2021 through to 30 June 2022, you need to get your application in by November. However, because you can't actually only apply for 1 year anymore, you do need to apply for the minimum amount of 2 years or up to 3 years. So if you want to pick up FY22 expenditure, you will also be putting in a figure for what you forecast to spend in FY 2023. However, these grant agreements, from what we're being told, are relatively malleable. So if you forecasted something at this point in time that in 12 months' time is irrelevant because the business has grown much faster, or actually there hasn't been as big an uptake, there is room to change those. It all comes down to the discussion with your Austrade advisor. But essentially, FY22 current year, if you want to get paid back for what you've spent and what you're soon to be spending in the next 6 months, 30 November, applications need to be in. Hopefully that answers that question properly. Moving on to the plan to market that I mentioned earlier, this is probably the biggest piece, or the most important piece that goes into the application, other than proving why and how you're eligible and how much you're going to spend. The plan to market is how they're going to pull together your grant agreement and your various milestones and how much grant you're entitled to. So in this marketing plan, you need to include the likes of why you're undertaking this marketing strategy, what are the business goals that you are hoping to achieve through the marketing strategy, how will you measure success of the marketing program, the overall budget for each year, as well as the various marketing activities that Tom mentioned earlier. You need to let them know in what categories you're going to be spending the money in, as well as letting them know what demographic, what countries are you targeting. The reason for letting them know that is when you may want to apply for a strategic shift, you can sort of say, hey, this was the history of what we looked at, and this is what we're now looking at now. We're making this shift to a new demographic, new country, etc. So that's the plan to market that you do want to be relatively accurate with, because that is what your milestone agreements will be based on.
Yeah. And Millie, how long should that document be?
So it doesn't actually need to be overly prescriptive. You just need to hit those main benchmarks. Oh, actually, thanks, Tom, for the prompt, because we should say that Austrade has templates that you can respond to each of those questions. However, they're not mandating that you use their template. So if you've already got something within the company that alludes to what those questions are, you can repurpose something that you've already got. Again, just remembering there are the key criteria you need to respond to in order for Austrade to put together your application. So it can be a page. It can be 10 pages. It just needs to hit those key criteria.
Thanks. Look, it's 1:45, and that is the time we allocated for the session. So we'll wrap it up, and we won't have any time for questions at the end, although we have answered all of the questions as we've been going along.
I think
just briefly, I'll go for it, mate.
There you go.
Just to talk about what our team can do. So we can help you with the sort of initial conversations around determining your eligibility and how to put forward the right messaging about why the business is eligible. We can then, of course, complete your application. We can prepare the key documents for you, which are, as Millie has said, really crucial. And then after you've signed a grant agreement, we can help you with your milestone reporting, which is going to be an ongoing exercise throughout the 2 or 3 years that you are awarded the grant for. So we are always keen to have conversations around eligibility with businesses. So please do get in touch. Here we go. Here's our details here for Millie and myself. And also we're all pretty nifty on QR codes now. If you just whip out your phone, there's a QR code there that will take you to our website.
Thanks, Tom. That was brilliant. So I think the key takeaways are it's a great opportunity to get 50% of your export costs refunded through this grant program. And it's a program that can go over a number of years. And I think the key thing for everybody on the call is that, again, the deadline is 30th of November. So if you're thinking about it, make sure you jump on it fairly quickly. And then also throughout your networks, if you've got other business owners who you feel this might be relevant to, of course, feel free to share the links of the video with them. So thanks for everyone for joining today. It's been really great. Tom and Millie are from the grants team, and they can also help out with a few other styles of engagement also around, you know, the R&D grants, incentives, female founders, accelerate in commercialization, and also all of the other grants and incentives as they're announced. So if you ever need a hand with them, please feel free to reach out. Thanks very much for everybody joining today.
Thanks, everyone. Hopefully